The golden light of the penthouse foyer caught the intricate lace of Seo Yoon's gown, a dress so perfectly tailored it seemed to be a part of her skin. To the outside world, Seo Yoon was the ultimate trophy of the Seoul elite, the wife of billionaire developer Kang In. She was the woman who graced the covers of fashion magazines, the philanthropist who chaired the city's most exclusive galas, and the embodiment of poise. Yet, to Kang In, as he watched her meticulously arranging a vase of fresh peonies on the mahogany sideboard, she was something far more intense. It wasn't just grace, it was a devotion so absolute it bordered on the suffocating. Seo Yoon didn't just manage their home, she lived for it, and more importantly, she lived for him. She insisted on preparing his breakfast with her own hands, her movements graceful and fluid, despite the fact that they had an entire staff of world-class chefs at their beck and call. She curated his schedule with a precision that bordered on the psychic, anticipating his needs before he could even articulate them. When he came home from a 12-hour day at the firm, she was always there, waiting at the door, her expression a mask of serene, doting affection. "You look tired, Kang In," she would say, her voice as smooth as velvet, her hands reaching out to straighten his tie or adjust his jacket. She never looked at her phone, never spoke of her own former life as a high-powered attorney, and never complained about the isolation of their ivory tower. Her entire existence had been narrowed down to a single focus, being the perfect wife for the man she worshipped. Kang In loved her, he truly did, but there were moments when he found himself staring at her from across the dining table, struck by the terrifying intensity in her eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated need that sometimes made the air in the room feel thin. She was beautiful, yes, but it was a cold, polished beauty that felt like a sculpture, something meant to be admired but never truly understood. He remembered a night, just a week ago, when he had forgotten to call and tell her he'd be working late. When he finally arrived home, the apartment was dark, but she had been standing in the middle of the living room, completely motionless, her eyes wide and unblinking in the moonlight. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't cried. She had simply asked, in a tone that was unsettlingly calm, "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think you could exist for even a moment without me knowing where you were?" The memory made his heart stutter. He watched her now, her back to him, her posture impeccable. She was humming a soft melody under her breath, a tune from their early days of courtship. Kang In walked up behind her and rested his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back into him immediately, a sigh of contentment escaping her lips. "You're home early," she whispered, her voice tight with a strange, frantic relief. "I didn't hear the car. I should have been at the door. I'm sorry, Kang In. I failed to be ready for you." Kang In frowned, his thumbs rubbing against the smooth silk of her dress. "Seo Yoon, it's fine. I don't need you to be waiting at the door every second of the day. You don't have to be perfect for me. You're my wife, not my employee." She stiffened under his touch, her shoulders rising as if he had struck a nerve. She turned around to face him, her eyes searching his face with a desperation that was masked by the perfect, chilling elegance of her features. "I want to be perfect for you," she said, her voice rising just a fraction. "What else is there? My life was nothing before I met you. You are my world, Kang In. Why would I want to be anything other than the woman who makes you happy?" Kang In looked at her, seeing the woman the public adored, the icy, graceful billionaire's wife, and then seeing the woman who trembled when he wasn't looking at her. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of unease. Her love felt like a beautiful, golden trap, a construct she had built to ensure he would never have a reason to look away. She began to clear the table, her movements efficient and almost robotic. He watched her, noticing how she insisted on hand-washing the porcelain dishes, refusing to let the staff touch them. It was a strange fixation, this need to handle every detail of his life herself. "The staff can handle that, Seo Yoon," he suggested, his voice gentle. She didn't look at him, her back still stiff. "They don't know your preferences. They don't know how you like the china stacked. They don't know you, Kang In. Only I do." He walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling, glowing expanse of Seoul. He had everything a man could want: power, wealth, and a wife who was the envy of every man in his social circle. Yet, standing there in the silence of their high-rise home, he felt as though he were living with a stranger. She was the perfect wife, but she was also a woman who seemed to be disappearing into the persona of his wife, her own identity sacrificed on the altar of their marriage. He wondered, briefly, What would happen if the facade ever cracked, if the carefully curated perfection of their life was challenged by something, anything, that threatened the narrow, obsessive definition of her role? She joined him at the window, sliding her arm through his. She felt cold, despite the warmth of the apartment. "We're going to the Halloween party tomorrow night," she reminded him, her voice suddenly bright and cheerful, a tone that sounded almost rehearsed. "I've spent weeks planning our costumes. It has to be perfect. Everyone will be watching us, Kang In. They'll see that we are the perfect couple." He turned to look at her, the moonlight casting long, sharp shadows across her face, accentuating the high, elegant bones that everyone in the city admired. "It's just a party, Seo Yoon. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to go." She turned her head, her eyes flashing with a sudden, unreadable intensity. "No," she replied, her voice soft and final. "We have to be perfect. Because if we aren't, then everything I've done, everything I've given up to be your wife, it wouldn't mean anything at all." He looked at her, his stomach dropping. It was a terrifying admission, a confession of the fragility of the life she had built. She wasn't just playing a role, she was fighting for her very survival, her self-worth tied entirely to his validation. He realized then that their marriage wasn't a partnership, it was a fragile, obsessive, and potentially volatile secret. As she leaned her head against his shoulder, her breathing rhythmic and shallow, Kang In felt the weight of her love pressing down on him, not like a comfort, but like a heavy, gilded crown. She was his wife, the perfect, cold billionaire's spouse, but beneath the surface, he sensed a hunger that was growing, a need that was becoming increasingly difficult to satisfy. Tomorrow night, they would play their parts on the stage of the Seoul elite, under the masks and the lights of the Halloween gala, oblivious to the fact that their carefully constructed reality was held together by a thread, and someone, somewhere, might just be waiting to pull it. He touched her cheek, but she remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the city below, looking for something he couldn't see, trapped in the rigid, obsessive architecture of her own heart. He knew that their marriage was the envy of all, but as he stood there in the quiet of their gilded cage, he could only hope that the party tomorrow wouldn't be the moment the glass finally shattered. The Warren Ballroom was a cavern of shimmering shadows and masked figures, a venue transformed for the evening into a gothic masquerade that blurred the lines between the elite and the surreal. Kang In felt the suffocating weight of his tuxedo, a stark contrast to the whimsical, terrifying masks worn by the city's most influential power players. Beside him, Seo Yoon was a vision of dark, calculated perfection. She had chosen to dress as a fallen queen, her gown a cascade of obsidian silk that clung to her frame, accented by a crown of blackened thorns that seemed to pierce the very air around her. She was terrifyingly elegant, her beauty sharpened by the stark, ghostly white of her makeup, a performance so committed that even Kang In found himself hesitating before he spoke to her. She moved through the crowd with an unnatural fluidity, never spilling a drop of her champagne, her smile fixed and porcelain perfect as she greeted the other socialites. To everyone watching, they were the highlight of the evening, the power couple whose marriage was a benchmark of grace and success. Kang In could feel the eyes of the room on them, a constant, judging pressure that Seo Yoon seemed to thrive on. She gripped his hand with a force that was surprisingly sharp, her fingers digging into his palm as if she were anchoring herself to him in the middle of a swirling storm. They drifted past the velvet ropes of the VIP section, where the champagne flowed like water and the laughter sounded like the clinking of gold coins. It was a playground for the wealthy, a place where rumors were the primary currency and every social interaction was a hidden blade. Kang In was distracted for a moment by a business rival, his attention stolen by a debate over market fluctuations, and in that brief lapse of focus, he let go of Seo Yoon's hand. She turned to speak to a group of laughing, masked women who were discussing the latest art auction, her posture poised and regal. It happened in the blink of an eye. A waiter, his face hidden behind a grimacing skull mask, drifted past their circle, his movements so subtle that no one else seemed to notice him drop a small, cream-colored envelope into the open clutch resting on Seo Yoon's lap. She didn't notice it immediately. She continued to laugh, her voice a tinkling bell of artificial delight, until one of the women beside her, a young heiress named Hygiene, playfully nudged her. "You have a message, Queen," Hygiene teased, pointing to the envelope that had slipped out of the clutch and onto the floor. Seo Yoon froze. She looked down, her gaze tracking the envelope as if it were a venomous snake, then reached down to retrieve it with fingers that were suddenly, noticeably trembling. She tore it open, her movements frantic and hidden from the view of the surrounding partygoers, and as her eyes scanned the single line of handwritten script, the air around her seemed to vanish. Kangyan, having finished his conversation, turned back to find her standing in the center of the crowd, her face a blank, shattered canvas. "Seo Yoon?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice low. She didn't look at him. She was staring at the paper, her breath hitching in a way that sounded like a dry, hacking sob. Kangyan reached out to take the note, his thumb brushing against the heavy, textured paper. In elegant, mocking cursive, it read. A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby group. Hygiene, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, peered over Seo Yoon's shoulder, her eyes widening as she read the words. "Oh, how droll," she exclaimed, her laughter bubbling up, sharp and careless. "Is this some kind of ironic performance art? Dirty housewife? Who's playing this cruel trick on you, Seo Yoon? It's simply absurd." The other women around them joined in, their giggles escalating into a chorus of amusement. They saw it as a joke, a biting, clever piece of theater designed to puncture the ego of the woman who held herself above everyone else. To them, the insult was a farce, because the idea of Seo Yoon being anything other than an ethereal, untouchable billionaire's wife was inherently funny. But Seo Yoon didn't laugh. She couldn't breathe. Kangyan watched, paralyzed, as the color drained from her face, leaving her ghostly makeup looking like a shroud. The perfect, graceful mask he had admired all evening was dissolving before his eyes. Her pupils were dilated, her breath coming in short, agonizing gasps that she was desperately trying to disguise as composure. She looked at the women laughing around her, the heiresses, the social climbers, the people she had curated her entire life to impress, and Kangyan saw, for the first time, a flash of something truly dangerous in her eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was a white-hot, singular rage that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. "Seo Yoon, let's go," Kangyan whispered, grabbing her elbow, desperate to pull her away from the public spectacle. "It's a joke. Just a cruel, anonymous joke. Don't give them the satisfaction of reacting." She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch. The mask was gone. The woman standing before him was not the graceful billionaire's wife he had brought to the party, she was a woman whose internal reality had been irrevocably breached. She crushed the note in her fist, her knuckles white, her breath hissing between her clenched teeth. "A joke," she whispered, the words so low they were almost lost in the music, yet they carried a weight that made the nearest woman stop laughing mid-giggle. "You think this is a joke?" She didn't scream. She didn't throw a drink. She simply smoothed her dress, her movements slow, precise, and terrifyingly calm, while her eyes scanned the crowd with the focus of a sniper. The laughter of the nearby group died down, an awkward, uncertain silence spreading through the ballroom like ink in a glass of water. They could feel the shift, the temperature of the room seemed to drop, and the gaze of the perfect wife was suddenly unbearable. Kangyan pulled her toward the exit, his heart hammering against his ribs, but he could feel her resisting, her feet planted firmly on the floor. She was searching. She was hunting. The anonymous note had acted as a trigger, a key turning in a lock that had been holding back something ancient and devastating. She didn't see a party anymore, she saw an audience that had mocked her deepest, most hidden obsession, and the mask of her grace had finally, definitively snapped. As they navigated their way out of the ballroom, every person she passed seemed to shrink, their smiles fading into uneasy, guarded expressions. They didn't know why, but they were afraid of her. Kangyan felt the cold dampness of his own sweat against his shirt. He knew what that note represented. It wasn't just an insult, it was a revelation of the one thing she feared more than death, the realization that the world saw through the performance she had staked her entire existence upon. They reached the elevators, the metal doors sliding shut to cut them off from the judging eyes of the gala, and the moment the space became private, Seo Yoon crumpled. She didn't cry. She leaned her head against the cold steel of the elevator wall, her fist still balled tightly at her sides, her eyes fixed on the numbers counting down to the ground floor. Kangyan stood beside her, afraid to touch her, afraid to speak, and afraid of the woman who had returned from the party in his wife's body. She was silent, but in the silence, he could hear the sound of a storm gathering, a psychic collapse that was destined to destroy everything they had ever built together. She wasn't just angry, she was becoming something else entirely, and as the elevator arrived at the lobby, he realized that the party was over, but the nightmare was only just beginning. The note had been a pinprick, but it had punctured the balloon of her sanity, and the air was finally rushing out. The ride back to the penthouse was a descent into an abyss of silence that felt heavier than a physical blow. Seo-yoon sat in the back of the limousine with her back ramrod straight, her hands resting on her lap like statues, the crushed note still clutched in her right fist. Kang-in sat beside her, his breath catching in his throat every time he looked at her profile. The pale, ghostly moonlight filtering through the tinted windows turned her skin into translucent marble, and her expression was so eerily serene that it made his skin crawl. When they finally stepped into the penthouse, the staff retreated immediately, sensing the tectonic shift in the air, leaving them alone in the cavernous, quiet expanse of their home. Seo-yoon didn't move toward the bedroom or the kitchen. She walked to the center of the living room and simply stood there, staring at the floor, her stillness a terrifying contrast to the chaotic rage Kang-in felt radiating from her in waves. "Seo-yoon, please," he started, his voice cracking, "it was just a stupid prank. No one who actually knows you believes a word of that. It's beneath you to care." She turned to him then, and the sight of her face froze the marrow in his bones. Her makeup was slightly smeared, her eyes dark, flat, and devoid of the performative warmth she usually wore like armor. She didn't look like a wife who had been insulted, she looked like a general who had just discovered a traitor in her ranks. "Beneath me," she repeated, her voice a soft, dangerous whisper that barely disturbed the air. "You think this was about dignity, Kang-in? You think I'm angry because someone called me a housewife?" She took a slow, calculated step toward him, her movements smooth and predator-like. "They didn't call me a housewife. They called me a dirty one. They insulted the only thing I have ever worked for. They insulted the labor, the devotion, the perfection I curate for you every single day. They tried to turn my dedication into a punchline." She began to move around the room, picking up items, a crystal glass, a designer accessory, a framed photograph of their wedding, and setting them down again with a clinical, deliberate gentleness that was far more unnerving than if she had smashed them. Kang-in watched her, his own mind racing, the internal monologue of a man realizing he was living with a stranger. She isn't just hurt. She's unspooling. This isn't about the note, it's about the fact that her entire reality is predicated on the idea that her perfection is an objective truth. If someone can see her as dirty, then her entire existence, the version of herself she built for me, is a lie. And she can't allow that lie to exist. She stopped at her desk and pulled out a sleek, black tablet, her fingers tapping across the screen with a speed that blurred. "I will find out who was near the clutch," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm, a flat monotone that lacked any human cadence. "I have the security logs from the gala. I have the guest list. I have the facial recognition software synced to the ballroom cameras." Someone laughed, Kang-in. Someone held that pen. Someone decided that my life was a joke. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. She's not going to stop at the person who wrote it. She's going to tear the entire social hierarchy apart until she finds the culprit. She's going to burn her reputation to the ground just to find the person who saw the cracks in her mask. He reached out to grab her hand, but she swerved away from him with a look of pure, clinical rejection. "Don't," she commanded, not looking at him. "Your comfort is not the priority right now. The integrity of this marriage is. If the world thinks I'm a joke, then the world is wrong. And I will make them understand that I am not just a wife. I am the woman who keeps this family standing. I am the woman who owns every detail of this life." Kang-in stepped back, watching her. "She's obsessed. She's not just in love with me, she's in love with the role she plays for me. She needs to be the ideal wife, the perfect, silent, domestic goddess, and anything that challenges that identity is a lethal threat to her consciousness. She's literally willing to destroy her own social world to prove she's clean." She looked up, her gaze pinning him to the spot. "You didn't defend me," she noted, the observation devoid of emotion. "You stood there and watched them laugh. Do you think I'm a joke, too, Kang-in? Do you think I'm just a dirty housewife you can dismiss when the world points a finger?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Kang-in realized that his own life was now secondary to the hunt. She wasn't asking for reassurance, she was demanding an allegiance that required him to participate in her madness. The elegance of her billionaire persona had vanished, replaced by an obsessive, jagged edge that made him feel as though he were standing in the presence of a bomb that had already been triggered. She turned back to the tablet, her eyes flicking across the data with a terrifying, singular focus. She's hunting them, he thought, the horror dawning on him. She's going to systematically destroy everyone who was at that table. And she'll do it with the same grace she uses to pour my tea. He watched her, a woman whose entire internal world had been hollowed out and rebuilt around the singular concept of being his perfect wife, and he finally understood the sheer, bottomless depth of her madness. She wasn't acting out of vanity, she was acting out of a desperate, primal fear of being ordinary, of being seen as anything less than the pinnacle of domestic devotion. If she wasn't the perfect wife, she was nothing, and she would kill the world before she accepted being nothing. As she continued her digital hunt, her voice a calm, rhythmic recitation of names and addresses, Kang-in stood in the shadow of the doorway, realizing that the woman he had married was not a person, but a project, and the architect of that project had finally decided that the world itself was an obstacle to her design. He felt a sudden, sharp fear for his own safety. If her perfection was the goal, what would she do if he, the source of that goal, ever tried to step out of the picture? She was searching for an enemy in the ballroom, but Kang-in looked at her and saw the enemy already standing in the room, wearing a gown of obsidian silk, her mind already consumed by the fire of her own creation. The hunt was on, and there was no power on earth that could stop her until the note, and the person who wrote it, were erased from existence. The silence in the penthouse became a physical entity, a thick, velvet shroud that muffled the sounds of the city beyond the glass. Seo-yoon remained glued to the tablet, her thumbs moving with such aggressive speed that the screen seemed to emit a faint, hum-like vibration. Kang-in hovered near the doorway, paralyzed by a mixture of fascination and profound, deep-seated terror. He watched her long, manicured fingers fly, seeing her pull up hidden surveillance feeds from the gala, zooming in on blurry faces, cross-referencing metadata with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate raider. She wasn't just searching for a prankster, she was compiling a hit list. Every time she zoomed in on a face, she muttered a name, an address, a financial history, facts she had no business knowing about the casual acquaintances of their social circle. She's not just using the security logs, Kang-in realized, his mind reeling as he pieced together the magnitude of her invasion. She's using our private accounts, our influence, maybe even illegal tracking software she's kept hidden for years. She has a dossier on everyone. Everyone. Even the people we've only met once. How long has she been building this? How long has she been preparing for the world to turn against her? Seo-yoon stopped suddenly, her breath hitching in her chest. A specific face appeared on the screen, a young woman, hardly 20, dressed in a whimsical pumpkin costume. She was laughing in the background of a frame, her hand casually holding the envelope that Seo-yoon had retrieved from the floor. The girl was a nobody, an intern at a third-tier PR firm, someone who likely had no idea that her trivial prank had touched off a landslide. But to Seo-yoon, she was a target, a vessel for the filth that had dared to stain the sanctity of her role. "Found you," Seo-yoon whispered, her voice so thin and fragile that it sounded like glass cracking under heat. She didn't look at Kang-in, she stared at the screen as if she were trying to incinerate the girl with her own psychic intent. She began to tap out a message, her expression a mask of chilling, polite composure. "If you don't believe the house of cards can fall, I'll show you exactly how the foundation is burned." Kang-in felt a wave of nausea. "Seo-yoon, stop. It's an intern. She doesn't even know what she's done. If you do anything to her, it'll be a scandal that you can't contain. This isn't just about the note anymore, you're talking about destroying a human life because of a joke." She turned to look at him, and for the first time, Kang-in saw the true depth of her obsession. Her eyes were not the eyes of the woman he had loved, they were the eyes of a woman who had transcended the bounds of reality to protect her identity. Her beauty, usually so soft and welcoming, now felt like a predatory, razor-edged landscape. "You don't understand," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of such profound, agonizing sincerity that it was harder to listen to than her rage. "I have no life outside of this, Kang-in. I have no name outside of yours. I have no purpose other than to be the reflection you see in the mirror every morning. If they see me as dirty, then they see the reflection is dirty. If the reflection is dirty, then what are you? What does that make you?" She walked over to him, the tablet still clutched in her hand like a weapon. She placed it against his chest, her touch light but heavy with the weight of her madness. "I am not doing this to hurt them. I am doing this to keep you pure. If I am not perfect, if I am not the ideal woman, then your success is compromised. Do you understand? I am the armor. I am the silence in the house. I am the reason you can sleep at night. I will not have my armor rusted by a nobody in a pumpkin costume. Kang In couldn't speak. He realized then that he was the hostage, not of a kidnapping, but of her perception. She had turned herself into his armor, and she was so terrified of being defective that she would literally kill or destroy anything that hinted at her fallibility. It was the ultimate, narcissistic trap. She had claimed that she lived for him, but in truth, she lived for the image of him living for her. If the image was threatened, the entire house had to go. She's going to make this girl vanish, he thought, the horror dawning on him. She'll use her connections at the PR firm to have her fired, she'll use her influence to blacklist her, she'll make her life a living hell, and she'll do it with a smile on her face while she's pouring my coffee. He saw her smile then, a fleeting, genuine, and terrifyingly sweet expression, as if she were genuinely proud of the efficiency of her plan. She was already mentally moving on, her calm returning as the digital hunt concluded. Go to bed, Kang In, she said, her tone returning to that smooth, rehearsed velvet. I have some arrangements to make. The staff will be busy tomorrow, so I'll handle the morning meal myself. I want to make sure your day starts exactly the way you like it. Everything will be perfect again. You'll see. As she walked away, her movements once again graceful and fluid, Kang In was left alone in the living room. He looked at the empty space where she had been standing, realizing that he was living with a phantom. He had spent years praising her grace, her cooking, her silent devotion, and now he realized that all of it was part of a meticulously constructed cage. He was the center of her obsession, the reason for her insanity, and the primary target of her protection. He didn't know if he was a husband or a prisoner, but as he heard her soft, hummed melody echoing from the kitchen, the sound of her preparing for the next day, the next act of the performance, he knew that he was trapped. He wasn't just in a marriage, he was in a performance piece that had gone horrifically wrong, and there was no exit door for a man whose wife was willing to go to the end of the earth to keep the curtains closed. He leaned against the wall, his head throbbing, listening to the soft, rhythmic clatter of dishes in the kitchen. She was cleaning. She was making everything perfect. And tomorrow, the world would be a little bit quieter, and a little bit cleaner, and he would have to wake up and kiss her and thank her for the coffee, pretending he didn't know the cost of the order she had restored. The hunt was over, the intern was gone, and the nightmare was just settling in for the long haul. Of the remnants of the night felt like an endless, suffocating vacuum until Kang In found his way into Seo Yoon's private study, a room he rarely entered, as she always insisted it was her sanctuary of domestic planning. What he found wasn't a schedule of household chores, but a haunting, architectural labyrinth of a life she had systematically dismantled. Tucked behind a wall of leather-bound journals were folders containing legal degrees, prestigious internship offers from international law firms, and letters of recommendation from the most powerful judges in the country. Seo Yoon hadn't just been a beautiful socialite, she had been a brilliant, ruthless legal mind, a woman who had been groomed to lead the nation's judiciary. She had been the top of her class, a prodigy who had vanished from the professional world 5 years ago, right at the moment she had met Kang In. Kang In sat at the desk, his hands trembling as he flipped through the documents. Each page was a testament to a life she had burned to the ground. There were notes scrawled in the margins of a Harvard Law acceptance letter. He needs a wife who is always present. He needs a wife who is not a competitor. I choose him over this empty, cold prestige. I choose to be the heart, not the head. It wasn't just a choice, it was a self-inflicted amputation. She had surgically removed her identity, layer by layer, to ensure there was nothing left of the woman who could rival him or be too busy to cater to his whims. Beneath the legal documents were hundreds of photographs of him, not just from their marriage, but from years before they had even met. She had been observing him, documenting his coffee preferences, his walking routes, and his habits long before she ever introduced herself as the woman of his dreams. The discovery hit Kang In with the force of an avalanche. She hadn't just fallen in love, she had been auditioning for the role of his wife for years, crafting a persona that was specifically calibrated to be the perfect, irreplaceable comfort. Every coincidence in their early courtship, every shared interest, every late-night conversation was a product of her relentless study. She hadn't sacrificed her career for love, she had sacrificed it to become a living, breathing artifact of his domestic satisfaction. Her obsession wasn't about him as a person, it was about the project of his life, which she had adopted as her only viable mission. He realized with a sickening clarity that she was terrified of the silence that would follow if she weren't the perfect wife. If she went back to the law, if she reclaimed her career, she would be an equal, a separate entity with a life that didn't revolve around him. But she couldn't afford that. To her, existence was a binary: either she was the irreplaceable anchor of Kangyan's life, or she was nothing at all, an empty shell drifting in a world that had no place for her without the validation of his presence. The note hadn't been an insult to her. It had been the sound of her glass ceiling shattering. It had reminded her that despite the years of service, despite the sacrifice of her brilliance, the world didn't see her as a saintly guardian, it saw her as a servant. It mocked the very foundation upon which she had rebuilt her sense of self. The note had stripped away the prestige of being Mrs. Kangyan left her with the reality she had spent 5 years running from: the fear of being seen as disposable. She wasn't just losing her temper, she was losing the only narrative that kept her afloat. Kangyan heard the click of the door and didn't have time to hide the folder. Seo Yoon stood in the threshold, her obsidian gown still rustling from the party, her makeup now wiped away to reveal a face that looked decades older than the one he had seen in the mirror hours ago. She didn't look angry, she looked like a woman who had been hollowed out by her own ghost. Her eyes scanned the desk, resting on the Harvard acceptance letter, and her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a strange, terrifying resignation. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said, her voice devoid of its usual, practiced warmth. "It was the only version of myself that had a spine. I had to kill her. I had to kill her so that you would never have to be alone, so that you would never have to come home to anything less than perfection." She walked toward the desk, her footsteps slow and heavy. "You think I'm obsessed? You think I'm crazy? I am the only thing standing between you and a life that doesn't understand your value. If I go back to being a lawyer, if I go back to being a person with ambitions of my own, I become a threat to your stability. You need a wife who is always there, always ready, always yours. I am the sacrifice that makes your life work." Kangyan looked at her, realizing that he had been living with a martyr of her own design. She had constructed a narrative where she was the hero, a woman who had saved his life by destroying her own, and she was so deep into this role that she couldn't distinguish between love and a life sentence. She was terrified of being useless, and because she had built her identity around his existence, his failure to value her as the perfect wife was effectively a declaration that she had no reason to exist. "Seo Yoon, this isn't love," he said, his voice straining. "This is a performance. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. You don't have to erase yourself to be important." She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that cut through the silence of the study. "Don't tell me what is love. I have given you everything. I gave you my mind, my career, my ambition, and I traded it all for a seat at your table. If I'm not the perfect wife, then I'm just a woman who wasted the best years of her life playing the maid to a man who doesn't understand the sacrifice. Do you know how many nights I spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was disappearing? But then you'd wake up, you'd reach for me, and I'd know it was worth it. I am the glue that holds your world together, and if someone calls me a dirty housewife, they aren't calling me a servant, they're saying that the glue is failing. And if the glue fails, the world breaks." Her words were a confession of her total, psychological annihilation. She had built herself into a box, and the moment a stranger's casual, cruel comment hinted that the box might be dirty, she panicked because she had nowhere else to be. She was an empty vessel filled with the reflection of his needs, and the note had been a mirror she couldn't bear to look into. She reached for the folder, her hands shaking, her eyes desperate. "Put those away," she pleaded, the billionaire's wife mask finally gone, revealing the terrified, broken young woman who had walked away from the law because she was too scared to be anything but his. "I am everything for you. I am your home. I am your perfection. You cannot let them take that away from me, Kangyan. You cannot let them see me as anything less." Kangyan realized that the hunt for the notewriter wasn't just a vendetta, it was a desperate, primal scream to reclaim the illusion that she was the center of his universe. She was fighting for her right to be his mirror, and she would destroy everyone, including herself, to make sure the reflection remained pristine. He looked at her, seeing a woman who had given up her sovereignty to become a shadow, and he finally understood the weight of the crown he had unwittingly forced her to wear. She didn't want him to love her, she wanted him to need her so desperately that she would never have to face the truth, that she had once been a person of her own, and she was terrified to ever meet her again. The penthouse had ceased to be a home and had transformed into a command center for a crusade of singular, terrifying focus. Seo Yoon moved through the rooms with a ghostly, predatory energy that made the very air feel electrified. She had abandoned the pretense of the doting wife, casting aside her silk gowns in favor of sharp, tactical business attire that mirrored the hardened intent in her eyes. Her campaign to identify the anonymous author of the note was not conducted through casual inquiry, it was a state-level operation. She deployed the full weight of her in Kang In's influence, utilizing a network of private investigators, digital forensics experts, and high-level surveillance contractors she had secretly cultivated over the years. Kang In watched in growing horror as the city's elite began to tremble. Her reach was impossible to ignore. She didn't just ask questions, she leveraged every debt, every secret, and every potential scandal of the gala's guests to force cooperation. When a tech magnate hesitated to turn over his private server logs, Seo Yoon simply threatened to expose his hidden, offshore embezzlement schemes to the regulatory authorities, her voice calm and devoid of malice, as if she were discussing the weather. Within 72 hours, the social circles of Seoul were paralyzed by a creeping, icy dread. They had come to the party to play, they were leaving with their lives dismantled by a woman they had once dismissed as a delicate flower. Seo Yoon, this is madness, Kang In argued, attempting to block her path in the study, his hands outstretched in a futile gesture of peace. You are destroying the very alliances that took us years to build. You're scaring people who were supposed to be our friends. Why is this note worth the reputation of the entire Warren group? She turned to him, her face a pale mask of concentration, her eyes darting between 4 separate monitors that tracked the movements of 3 different suspects. Friends, she scoffed, the word sounding like a profanity. There are no friends in this game, Kang In. There are only those who fear you and those who want to see you bleed. If one of them wrote that note, they don't just deserve to be ostracized, they deserve to be erased. They challenged my role in your life. If I let them walk away, the message is clear, I am replaceable. And I will not be replaced by a prankster's cowardice. Her obsession had metastasized, leaking into every facet of their lives. She had set up a dedicated war room in their guest suite, where screens flashed with the grainy, high-resolution faces of party guests, their lives dissected into data points. She was no longer just the woman who cooked his meals and straightened his tie, she was a sovereign entity of pure control. Kang In felt his own autonomy dissolving in the wake of her paranoia. Every time he tried to intervene, she would simply look at him with a gaze that held a terrifying, empty adoration, assuring him that she was doing this for them. It's all for us, my love, she whispered, her touch light but heavy with the weight of her madness. If I don't stop them, they will keep whispering. They will keep chipping away at the foundation until you stop believing I am perfect. Do you want to believe I am perfect, Kang In? You have to, because if you don't, the whole world falls apart. Her logic was circular and impenetrable, a self-sustaining loop of insanity that was rapidly consuming the rational world. Kang In attempted to reach out to the authorities, hoping to curb her influence, only to find that she had already anticipated his moves. Her connections reached into the police department and the local government, effectively neutralizing his attempts to seek outside help. She had spent 5 years creating an invisible web of leverage, and now, she was using it to hunt a phantom. As the days bled into a week, the elite of Seoul began to avoid them with a desperate, frantic intensity. The invitations to galas stopped coming, not because they weren't welcome, but because everyone was terrified of what might happen if they dared to breathe the same air as Seo Yoon. She didn't seem to notice the isolation, she viewed it as a victory. She was weeding the garden, pruning the weak, and securing the perimeter of their lives against the threat of ridicule. Kang In tried to speak to her about the future, about their life beyond this hunt, but she only grew more distant, her focus locked on the final, elusive suspect, a young, impulsive student who had been seen near their table at the gala. She's the one, Seo Yoon murmured, her hand lingering over a photograph of a girl he didn't even recognize. She wrote it. She saw me, she felt the insignificance of her own life, and she tried to project her filth onto me. I'm going to make sure she never laughs again. Kang In felt his pulse race with terror. Seo Yoon, she's a child. She doesn't even know who you are. Leave it alone. But the request was useless. She was already placing the call, her voice projecting a cold, melodic authority that promised the total destruction of the girl's future. She was becoming a monster of their own creation, a creature of obsession who believed that the only way to save her marriage was to ensure that no one else in the world had the capacity to perceive her as anything less than an untouchable god. Kang In retreated to the balcony, the cold night air doing nothing to settle the nausea churning in his stomach. He was the center of her universe, but that universe was currently a burning, chaotic wreck, and he realized with a terrifying finality that his efforts to stop her were only fueling her delusion. She wasn't just hunting for a prankster, she was hunting for a reason to justify her existence, and she would tear the entire city of Seoul apart before she allowed that search to go unfulfilled. He saw the dark sedan idling in the driveway, the security detail standing like stone statues, and he knew they were waiting for her next command. She was the billionaire's wife, the elegant, graceful queen of the elite, and she was currently committing social and professional suicide to protect an image that existed only in her own fractured mind. Every step he took to stop her was met with a new, more elaborate strategy of dominance, as if the very act of opposition confirmed to her that she had to work harder to maintain their perfection. He was the prisoner of her armor, watching as she polished the blades that would eventually cut them both, her obsession a relentless, grinding engine that cared for nothing but its own momentum. As he looked back through the floor-to-ceiling glass at the woman hunched over her glowing screens, her face a mask of predatory calm, he knew that the nightmare was far from over. She wouldn't stop at the girl in the pumpkin costume, she would keep digging, keep hunting, and keep destroying until the entire world either bowed to her or was left in ruins, and he was the only witness to the slow, agonizing, and completely preventable collapse of the woman he had once called his home. He leaned his head against the glass, his own reflection ghostly and pale against the city lights, and realized that there was no way out, because she had already bought the exit and set it on fire. The hunt was the only thing she had left, and she was going to make sure it lasted for as long as she could force the world to watch. The intensity of her hunt had reached a fever pitch, crossing the line from corporate scrutiny into outright psychological warfare. Kang-in sat in the shadows of the living room, listening to the muffled rhythm of her voice as she dictated terms to a high-profile legal firm over the phone. She was currently ordering them to freeze the assets of a woman whose only crime was being the mother of the girl who had allegedly scribbled the note. It was a scorched earth policy that made even the most cutthroat moguls in Seoul look like amateurs. The elite, who once treated them as the ultimate power couple, now treated their residence like a radioactive site. They were ghosting them, canceling meetings, ignoring calls, and physically distancing themselves whenever Seo Yoon appeared in public. She didn't seem to care, she thrived on the fear she cultivated. He watched her hang up the phone, her posture easing into a graceful, predatory languor. She walked toward the liquor cabinet, her movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. "They're learning, Kang-in," she said, pouring herself a neat glass of whiskey. "The more they fear the consequences of their insolence, the more they respect the sanctity of this marriage. It's a necessary correction. When you live in the sun, you have to be prepared to burn those who try to cast a shadow on you. She's lost the ability to distinguish between a social insult and an existential threat," Kang-in thought, his blood running cold as he processed the sheer scale of her delusion. "She isn't just protecting our reputation, she's trying to build a world where she cannot be criticized, and she's willing to sacrifice every moral boundary we ever had to do it." He tried to reach for the tablet on the table, to delete the data, to cut the power, to do anything to snap her out of the trance, but she was faster. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with a strength that betrayed her elegant facade. "Don't," she whispered, her face inches from his, her eyes dark and unblinking. "You don't understand the work I'm doing. If I stop, the lie stops. If the lie stops, they'll see me as I truly am, a woman who has nothing but you. And if they see that, they'll see that I'm just as fragile as they are. And I will never let them see that." She pressed the glass of whiskey into his hand, her touch lingering, heavy and possessive. "Finish your drink, darling. We have a lot of work to do. By tomorrow, no one in this city will dare speak your name without bowing their head. We are making our life bulletproof." He stood there, the glass vibrating in his grip, feeling the terrifying, claustrophobic heat of her devotion. He realized that her madness had become a tangible architecture, a home she was fortifying against the reality of her own insecurity. She had abandoned the woman she used to be, and she had abandoned the truth of their relationship, all to craft this perfect, terrifying, untouchable reality. He looked at the woman he loved, the woman who had been his grace, his status, and his pride, and saw only the wreckage of a person who would burn the entire city of Seoul to the ground just to stay warm in the center of her own private hell. He took a sip of the drink, the liquid burning his throat like regret, knowing that the hunt wasn't just for a note writer, it was a hunt for the man who would finally tell her that she was enough, even if he knew she would never believe him. The transformation of Seo Yoon from a graceful, high-society billionaire's wife into an omnipresent warden was not an event, but a slow, calculated erosion of Kang-in's autonomy. The hunt for the anonymous note writer had morphed into a permanent state of emergency, and Kangin found himself living in a world where his personal space had effectively ceased to exist. Every aspect of his life was now subject to Seo Yoon's scrutiny, her possessiveness expanding like a dark, creeping vine. His professional life, once a source of stability, was now a battlefield of suspicion. She insisted on reviewing his daily calendar with the severity of a warden, demanding to know the name, gender, and purpose of every person he encountered. If a female intern so much as spoke to him about a technical drawing, Seo Yoon would appear in his office within the hour, her presence chilling the room to its core. She wouldn't shout, she would simply stand at the doorway, her silhouette sharp and menacing, watching with a calm, predatory gaze until the woman in question fled. Kangin felt the walls of his professional reputation buckling under the weight of her jealousy. Colleagues began to avoid him, fearing that a casual conversation could result in their own termination or a public scandal engineered by Seo Yoon's influence. His social circle was systematically pruned, with every female acquaintance, regardless of how brief or professional the relationship, being labeled a threat to their perfection. She monitored his phone, not by hacking it, but by constantly lingering in the room, her eyes tracking the movement of his thumbs as he typed. The perfect love he had once mistaken for devotion was now a barbed wire fence that circled his existence. Kangin sat in his study one evening, watching her through the glass partition. She was meticulously organizing a list of his contacts, crossing out names with a red pen, her lips pulled back in a thin, satisfied smile. It was a terrifying sight. She was deciding who he was allowed to know, what he was allowed to hear, and who he was allowed to be. She's not just protecting our marriage, he thought, his heart sinking into a pit of cold despair. She's erasing me. She's pruning my life until there's nothing left but her. I'm a doll in her display case, and anyone who isn't her is just an obstacle to be removed. He realized with a jolt of horror that he was beginning to fear her, not in the way one fears an enemy, but in the way a prey animal fears the movement of a shadow. When he tried to talk to her, her responses were measured, chillingly sweet, and designed to make him feel like he was the one who was unstable. "Why are you looking at me like that, Kangin?" she asked, her voice a soft, melodic trap as she approached him, her hand trailing down his spine. "Don't you feel safer now that I've cleared the noise? Don't you feel how much better it is, now that it's just us? No distractions. No threats. No one else who could possibly matter as much as we do." The intimacy she demanded was claustrophobic. She wanted him to report his thoughts, his moods, and his every physical desire, and if he held anything back, she would grow quiet, her eyes darkening with a hurt that felt like a threat. He was living on eggshells in a mansion of marble, knowing that one wrong move, one glance at another woman, or one moment of independence would be the spark that ignited her obsession into a truly violent display. The ideal life had become a death sentence for his identity. He had become a prisoner to her standards, a man whose only value was as her reflection, and as he watched her in the kitchen, carefully hand-polishing the silver for their dinner, he saw a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. She was singing that same soft tune, the one from their courtship, but now it sounded like a funeral dirge. She's not going to stop, he realized, his chest tight with a panic he couldn't afford to show. She's going to keep pulling until I'm just a hollowed-out skin of the man she married. And if I try to walk away, I'm not just leaving a wife, I'm leaving a captor who has enough power to bury me before I even hit the door. He caught himself constantly checking his watch, calculating how long he had until she would demand his presence, his heart rate spiking whenever her footsteps approached the door. He was becoming a man defined by his own anxiety, his actions and words carefully filtered through the lens of her potential reaction. It was a masterclass in psychological domestic terror. She hadn't needed to lock him in a room because she had locked him in her perception of who he should be. He was hers, he was perfect, and she would burn the entire world to keep him that way. He sat in his office, his head in his hands, wondering if anyone in the world could see the man who was disappearing inside the golden shell. "I'm a billionaire, and I'm a hostage," he thought, the irony making him feel like he was losing his mind. "And the worst part is, she thinks this is the most romantic thing she could possibly do for me." He stood up, trying to compose his face, because he heard her voice echoing in the hallway, calling for him to come and share a glass of wine, her tone bright and inviting. He walked out of the study, his hands in his pockets to hide the way they trembled, stepping back into the performance of a life that felt like a slow-motion collapse. She was waiting for him, her beauty radiant, her eyes wide with a frantic, needy love that made him feel like he was suffocating in silk. She kissed him, her lips pressing against his with a possessive, territorial intensity, and he kissed her back, not out of passion, but out of a desperate, primal urge to keep the monster beneath her skin from waking up. He was her perfect husband, he was her life's work, and as they sat down to dinner, he knew that the fear he felt was the only thing that was truly honest about their life. He smiled when she smiled, he ate when she ate, and he listened to her recount the progress she had made in securing their isolation, his mind a silent, terrified scream of realization that he was living with a woman who had decided that his life was a costume she could fit him into, and she would trim away anything that didn't conform to her vision. As he raised his glass to hers, the delicate chime of the crystal sounded like the closing of a cell door, and he realized with a heart-wrenching, absolute certainty that he was no longer Kangen, he was a possession, a work in progress, and the woman sitting across from him, with her beautiful, empty eyes, was waiting to finish the job. He was terrified, he was trapped, and as he watched her perfect, manicured fingers toy with her fork, he knew that the nightmare of their perfection was far from over, it was just entering its final, most dangerous act. The dread grew into a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated beneath his skin, transforming every ordinary moment into a test of survival. Kanyen found himself adopting behaviors he despised. He began double-checking his location services, wiping his call logs, and scrubbing his digital presence, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he was terrified that Seo Yoon would interpret a generic notification as a sign of betrayal. She had mastered the art of benevolent monitoring. She would send him bouquets of flowers to his office midday, followed immediately by a call asking who he had shared his lunch with, her voice as light as air but sharp as a guillotine. It was impossible to draw a line because she never crossed it with anger, she crossed it with concern. I am being dismantled, he realized, watching her one morning as she adjusted his collar, her movements lingering just long enough to be an assertion of ownership. She isn't even looking at me as a husband anymore, she's looking at me as a malfunctioning appliance that needs constant recalibration. She thinks if she keeps tweaking my environment, my friends, my schedule, my very perception, she can prevent me from ever realizing that I'm drowning. The fear reached its peak during a business meeting he had insisted on attending alone. He had spent the entire morning convincing her that his presence was vital for the Warren expansion, and he felt a sickening surge of triumph when she finally allowed it. Yet, when he walked into the boardroom, he found her sitting at the head of the table, smiling at his startled colleagues. She hadn't forbidden him from going, she had simply arrived ahead of him to curate the environment. She had spoken to every board member, subtly poisoning the well by implying that Kangen was going through a difficult period and needed her constant, watchful care. When he returned home that evening, exhausted and stripped of his professional dignity, she was waiting with a candlelit dinner, her eyes bright with a manic, triumphant gleam. "You were so impressive today, Kangen," she said, her voice dropping into that familiar, suffocating whisper. "But you looked so lost without me. I hope you realize how much you need this structure. I've taken the liberty of declining your requests for independent travel next month. I've already informed the board that I will be accompanying you on all business trips from now on. It's for your own good, darling. I can't bear the thought of the world taking you away from me for even a few days." He looked at her, seeing the terrifying, radiant beauty of her obsession, and knew there was no room for him to speak. She had finalized the cage. He was no longer a partner, he was a ward. The silence of the penthouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like the interior of a pressurized chamber, and as he sat down to eat, he realized that if he didn't find a way to escape this perfect life, he would soon wake up and find that the man he once was had been completely, surgically erased, leaving nothing behind but the husband she had always wanted, a shell that echoed with the hollow, beautiful music of her own madness. He took a bite of the food she had prepared, the taste perfectly balanced, perfectly curated, and perfectly poisonous. He was a billionaire, he was the envy of the city, and he was absolutely, completely doomed. The investigation into the anonymous note had become an obsession that transcended mere curiosity, evolving into a hunt that consumed every waking hour of Seo Yoon's life. Kangen had watched with growing horror as she systematically dismantled the lives of everyone who had even breathed the same air as them at that Halloween party. Finally, she tracked the origin of the paper to a minor, inconsequential source, a 20-year-old student named Jisoo, an intern at a catering company that had worked the event. Kangen was forced to sit in the cold, industrial basement of a private security firm in the outskirts of Seoul as Seo Yoon confronted the girl. The young woman was trembling, her face pale with terror, sitting in a metal chair under the harsh, clinical light of a fluorescent bulb. She was barely out of her teens, a nobody whose existence hadn't even been a ripple in Seo Yoon's world until this moment. When Seo Yoon demanded to know why she had left the note, The girl collapsed into a fit of sobbing. Her explanation is banal and devastatingly hollow as the note itself. She had been dared by her friends to leave a random, biting message for a stranger, a cruel, high school-style prank intended to stir up a bit of unearned chaos in the lives of the wealthy people they served. She didn't even know who Seo Yoon was. She hadn't targeted her specifically. She hadn't been an enemy agent, a rival for Kang In's affection, or a secret observer of their marriage. She was just a bored, impulsive teenager who thought it would be funny to write something hurtful to a random, masked stranger. The revelation was not the dramatic, cinematic confrontation Seo Yoon had built in her mind. It was a pathetic, small, and utterly random act of cruelty that had meant nothing to the person who committed it. Kang In watched Seo Yoon's reaction, expecting her to laugh, to dismiss the girl, to realize the absurdity of the terror she had unleashed upon their lives. Instead, Seo Yoon stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the weeping girl, her face a mask of profound, icy confusion. "You didn't know?" Seo Yoon whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't know who you were writing to? It was just a dare?" The intern nodded frantically, her tears dripping onto her uniform. "It was just for fun. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean anything by it, I swear." Seo Yoon looked at Kang In, and the expression on her face was not relief, it was a total, absolute collapse of her psychic framework. The fact that the insult had been random, that it hadn't been a calculated attack on her identity as the perfect wife, stripped away the last remaining logic of her hunt. If the world didn't care enough to target her specifically, if her life could be disrupted by a random, meaningless act of a stranger, then her perfection was not a fortress, it was a thin, fragile shell that anyone, at any time, could puncture with a flick of a pen. Kang In felt the ground shift beneath him. He saw the girl leave, sobbing and traumatized, but Seo Yoon didn't move. She stood there, the weight of the absurdity finally crushing her. "It meant nothing," she murmured, her voice hollow, devoid of its usual, sharp authority. "All this time, I thought there was an enemy, a rival, someone who understood the weight of what I've done. Someone who saw that I am the only one who keeps his life intact. But it was just noise. It was just a child with a pen." Kang In stepped toward her, his hands extended, but he stopped short. He realized that this revelation was far more dangerous than the threat of an enemy. An enemy could be defeated, neutralized, or negotiated with. But a random, meaningless insult? That was the reality of the world she had tried to shield him from, a world that didn't care about their status, their money, or her frantic, obsessive devotion. The world saw her not as a queen or a guardian, but as a dirty housewife, and the fact that it was a random, flippant, meaningless remark made it all the more terrifying. It meant that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she sacrificed, she was always vulnerable to the chaos of the outside world. She looked at Kang In, her eyes wide, glassy, and deeply, profoundly broken. The trigger had been pulled, but the gun was empty. She had waged a war against the elite of Seoul, destroyed her alliances, and terrified her husband, all for a prank that wasn't even about her. She wasn't an architect of destiny, she was a victim of her own overinterpretation of a meaningless existence. Kang In felt a wave of pity so intense it burned, but behind it was the persistent, cold fear of what she would do now that she realized her crusade had been a phantom. She had spent 5 years erasing herself to be the perfect wife, and the world had looked at her work and called it dirt. She wasn't a saint or a guardian of their marriage, she was a woman who had given up her own humanity for a script that the audience didn't even care to read. Seo Yoon didn't scream. She didn't lash out. She just turned around and walked out of the room, her movements stiff, jerky, and lacking the feline, calculated grace she had perfected. Kang In followed her, his own heart heavy with the weight of the realization. She had staked her entire soul on the idea that her role as the perfect wife was the most important thing in the universe, and this moment had proven that, to the rest of the world, she was just another person to be mocked. She reached the elevator, her fingers hovering over the buttons, and for a moment, he thought she might break down completely, but she didn't. She looked at her own reflection in the brushed steel door, her face a pale, vacant ruin. "I am perfect," she whispered, her voice a hollow, rhythmic chant. "I am the only one who loves him. I am the only one who matters." She was doubling down. Even with the truth exposed, that it was all for nothing, that the insult was meaningless, she couldn't accept it. To accept that the insult was random was to accept that she was not the center of his universe, that she was not the guardian of his fate, but merely a woman in a house with a man who was growing increasingly afraid of her. She looked at Kang-in, her expression once again shifting into a mask of terrifying, polite composure. "We need to go home, Kang-in," she said, her tone as dry as bone. "There is still so much work to be done. If they think I'm a joke, then I need to show them that I'm the joke they can't afford to make." Kang-in watched her, the dread intensifying. She hadn't learned. She hadn't been humbled. She had been pushed further into the obsession, the meaningless note becoming a permanent, unhealable wound that she would now use to justify every future act of violence, control, or madness. The girl with the pumpkin costume had no idea that she had just signed a warrant for the destruction of a billionaire dynasty, and Kang-in realized that he was married to a woman who would rather build a fortress of corpses than admit she was just human. He followed her into the elevator, his own life feeling like a fragile, dying thing, and as the steel doors slid shut, sealing them in the quiet, metallic tomb of their high-rise life, he knew that the hunt hadn't ended, it had only just begun to target the very core of their marriage. The note was just the start, the obsession was now the only thing she had left to define her, and she was going to turn his world into a place where nobody, not even the random interns of the city, could ever dare to laugh at her again. He looked at her reflection, seeing the beautiful, empty, and deeply, profoundly lost woman she had become, and he finally understood that he was trapped not by her power, but by her deep, bottomless fear of being truly, insignificantly herself. She was the perfect wife, and he was the man who had to watch her burn the world down to prove it. The ride home was an exercise in absolute, chilling stillness. Seo-yoon did not speak a single word, her fingers rhythmically tapping against her clutch, the same clutch that had held the note. Every rhythmic beat sounded like a hammer against the fragile glass of their shared reality. Kang-in stared out into the blurred lights of the city, realizing that the truth had acted as a catalyst for a psychosis he was no longer equipped to handle. He had expected her to be relieved that there was no stalker, no mastermind, no professional rival. Instead, she had taken the meaninglessness of the act as a personal insult from the universe itself. She wasn't fighting a person anymore, she was fighting the cold indifference of existence, and she was determined to beat it into submission. She's going to make this girl suffer for the crime of being unimportant, he thought, the horror of it settling deep into his chest. And she'll justify it by saying she's protecting our purity. She can't exist in a world where she isn't significant, so she's going to force the world to fear her until it creates a significance for her. As they reached the penthouse, Seo-yoon didn't wait for the security team to open the doors. She stepped out, her posture rigid, and marched toward the elevators without a backward glance. When they reached the upper floor, she didn't head to their bedroom, she headed straight for the war room, the suite she had converted into an observation deck for her paranoia. Kang-in stood in the hallway, watching as she turned on the monitors. The screens bathed her in a harsh, clinical blue light, making her look like a phantom haunting a graveyard of her own making. She laughed, Kang-in, Seo-yoon said suddenly, her voice devoid of any inflection. The girl in the costume, she didn't write it because she hated me. She wrote it because to her, I am just a prop in her mediocre life. She thinks I am a housewife because that is all the value she could imagine for a woman like me. She paused, her eyes widening as if seeing a horrific vision. I gave up everything for you so I could be the only thing that defined your life. If I am just a housewife to her, then what have I been doing for these 5 years? What have I become? You've become a monster, Kang-in wanted to scream, but the words died in his throat. He saw her begin to pull up files, tax records, school transcripts, personal medical histories of everyone who had been at that table. She was scrubbing the gala guest list, not to find the culprit, but to punish the audience. She was going to make sure that everyone who had been present at the party knew that laughing at her was a mistake that would haunt them for generations. It's not about the note anymore, she whispered, her hands shaking as she typed out a series of aggressive legal directives to their corporate counsel. It's about the fact that they dared to perceive me as anything less than an architect of their own reality. I will ensure that every single person in that ballroom understands that to laugh at me is to forfeit their future. Kang-in retreated to the bedroom, the heavy doors offering no real protection from the madness that was seeping into every corner of their home. He realized then that their marriage was the casualty. She wasn't his wife, she was an obsessive force of nature that had centered itself entirely on his existence, and she would now use that obsession to destroy anything or anyone that cast a shadow on her curated, artificial perfection. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the soft, rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the keyboard in the next room, a sound that would now follow him into his dreams, the ticking of a clock that heralded the end of their sanity. She was searching for her reflection, and she would kill anything that didn't show her exactly what she wanted to see. The air in the penthouse had become a suffocating, pressurized dome of silence, the kind that preceded a cataclysm. Seo Yoon had been locked in her war room for 48 hours, her obsession with the note writer having spiraled into a digital hunt that involved dismantling the lives of everyone who had even been in the room that night. Kang-in had spent those 2 days hovering in the shadows of their home, unable to eat, unable to sleep, feeling the cold dread of living with a ghost. He finally gathered the courage to enter the room as the sun began to bleed into the horizon, the city outside glowing with the indifference of a million strangers. Seo Yoon was slumped in her leather chair, the glow of the monitors casting harsh, rhythmic light over a face that had lost its mask of steel. She wasn't typing anymore. Her hands, which had been the instruments of her calculated revenge, were resting uselessly in her lap, fingers trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrolled tremor. The room was a disaster of discarded folders, open legal files, and the scattered, jagged remnants of the lives she had spent the last 2 days dismantling. When she looked up, Kang-in didn't see the billionaire's wife. He didn't see the queen of the social elite or the woman who had terrorized the ballroom with her cold, surgical precision. He saw a girl, small and withered, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow, the makeup washed away to reveal the raw, trembling skin of someone who had been holding up a falling sky for far too long. She didn't lunge for the tablet. She didn't start reciting the financial ruin of her enemies. She just stared at him, and for the first time in their marriage, there was no calculation, no performance, and no strategy. It was a look of pure, agonizing defeat. "I can't find her, Kang-in," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread of sound that barely filled the space between them. "I've burned everything. I've reached into every corner of their lives, I've taken their money, their homes, their dignity. And the note is still there. It's still there in my head, mocking me, telling me that I am nothing. I am just a dirty housewife to them. I am nothing." She stood up, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, and for a terrifying second, Kang-in thought she might collapse. She walked toward him, not with the predatory grace of the chairman, but with the stumbling, desperate gait of a woman whose legs were failing her. She stopped in front of him, her chest heaving, and reached out to touch the lapel of his jacket, her fingers snagging on the wool. "Do you know what I did to get here?" she asked, a tear finally tracing a path through the faint, ghostly traces of her foundation. "I was 22. I had the world at my feet. I had law degrees, I had offers from every major firm, I had a life where I could have been anyone. I was brilliant, Kang-in. I was so incredibly brilliant." She let out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on concrete. "But I looked at you, and I decided that your life was the only one that mattered. I decided that to keep you, I had to stop being a person. I had to become a reflection. I stopped being a lawyer, I stopped being a woman with a name, and I started being your wife. I turned myself into a mirror so that you could see how perfect your life was." She dropped her hands, her gaze turning inward. "I've spent 5 years being terrified of the silence. I was terrified that if I stopped being perfect, if I stopped being the glue, the armor, the silent, graceful wife, you would wake up one morning, look at me, and realize that I'm not a woman. I'm just a placeholder. I'm just a set of chores and a pretty face you bought with your success. I've been so scared that one day, you'd realize that you don't actually need me. That you're the billionaire, and I'm just the dirty housewife you tolerate for the sake of the image." The meltdown was not loud, it was quiet, intimate, and profoundly, painfully devastating. She sank to her knees in the center of the debris of her hunt, her head dropping into her hands as the dam finally, irrevocably broke. The woman who had been the architect of the city's social terror was now sobbing, a broken, rhythmic sound of a child who had finally realized the game was over. Kang-in stood over her, his own heart shattering into pieces he had never anticipated. He had seen her as a monster, as a captor, as a woman who had used him for status, but he hadn't seen the pathetic, starving soul beneath it all. She hadn't been playing a game of power for the sake of power, she had been playing for the right to exist in his life without being discarded. She was a woman who had hollowed out her own soul to build him a temple, and now that the temple was being criticized, she felt the entire structure of her identity crushing her. "Seo Yoon," he said, his voice thick with a sorrow he couldn't name. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly before finally resting on her hair. She didn't recoil, she collapsed into him, her forehead pressed against his chest, her body shaking with the force of her release. "I'm just so tired, Kang-in," she choked out, her words muffled by his shirt. "I'm so tired of being perfect. I'm so tired of being your mirror. If I'm not perfect, you won't want me. If I'm not perfect, you'll see the mess I made of my life. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I'm anything at all without this role." He looked around at the monitors, the digital evidence of the lives she had destroyed in her search for the prankster, and the absurdity of it all hit him with a final, crushing weight. She had destroyed real people to protect a fake version of herself that he hadn't even asked for. She was a deeply broken woman, a prisoner of a script she had written for herself, and she was so terrified of being unnecessary that she had turned herself into an unavoidable, dangerous necessity. He held her as she wept, feeling the frantic, desperate heartbeat of a woman who was mourning her own lost potential. She wasn't the billionaire's wife anymore, she was a victim of her own obsessive devotion, a woman who had sacrificed everything to be an ideal that no one had ever asked her to reach. The terrifying billionaire was gone, replaced by a human being so fundamentally fractured that he could only stare into the void she had created. He realized then that he couldn't leave her, but he also couldn't stay in the life she had constructed. He had to be the one to tell her the truth she couldn't face, that she was enough, even if she were dirty, even if she were a housewife, even if she were just a woman who had made a mistake and chose to be human. But as he held her, he knew that the road to that truth was paved with the ruins of everything they had become. She was a broken woman, but she was a woman he had allowed to break herself for his own convenience, and as he sat on the floor of the room filled with the digital evidence of her madness, he finally saw the reflection she had been trying to hide, a woman who was terrified of being human, and a man who had finally realized that their life of perfection was the most dangerous, cruelest, and saddest thing he had ever seen. The hunt was over, the mystery of the note was revealed as a tragedy of ego, and for the first time, Kang-in wasn't afraid of his wife. He was simply, profoundly, heartbroken for the woman who had erased her own existence for a man she didn't realize was just as lost as she was. He cradled her while the city below began to wake, the light of dawn creeping into the room to illuminate the scattered files and the shattered woman in his arms, the perfect wife finally, irreversibly, and tragically human. The silence that followed her confession was not empty, it was heavy with the debris of 5 years of carefully constructed deception. Kang-in sat on the cold floor, the moonlight catching the tears on Seo-yoon's face, turning them into shimmering, jagged diamonds. He felt the phantom weight of her perfection pressing against his chest, realizing that every morning he had woken up to the smell of fresh coffee and the sight of her poised silhouette, he had been witnessing a slow-motion act of self-erasure. She wasn't just his wife, she was a ghost of the law student she had been, a spirit he had unwittingly helped her bury. She isn't evil, he realized, the anger that had defined his last few days softening into a dull, aching sorrow. She's a woman who turned herself into a product for me to consume, and she's terrified that once I realize the product is flawed, I'll discard it. She doesn't understand that she was never a product. She was the only thing in my life that actually had a pulse. He pulled her closer, his hands moving over her shaking shoulders. She was fragile, so impossibly fragile that he feared if he gripped her too hard, she would simply shatter into dust. For a long time, the only sound was the jagged, rhythmic rhythm of her breathing, a sound of someone who had finally run out of air. "I never asked you to be perfect, Seo-yoon," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her panic. "I asked you to be my wife. I asked you to walk through this life with me. I didn't want the performance. I wanted you." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes wide, glassy, and searching his face for the rejection she was certain was coming. The mask of the billionaire queen was completely gone, leaving a face that was raw, exposed, and painfully young. "But look at what I became," she whispered, gesturing vaguely at the monitors, at the legal filings, at the evidence of her own cruelty. "Look at the mess I made. Look at the people I ruined just to protect a title. If I'm not perfect, Kang-in, then all of this horror was for nothing. It was just malice. It was just hate." Her voice broke on the final word, a sound of pure, unadulterated realization. She had finally connected the dots. She hadn't been fighting for love, she had been fighting to validate the slaughter of her own conscience. The meltdown was no longer just about the note, it was about the sudden, terrifying clarity that she had burned down her own soul for the sake of an image that no one, not even her husband, had actually demanded. She was a woman who had built a kingdom of ashes and was finally being forced to breathe the soot. Kanyin didn't answer. He couldn't. He watched as she began to tear at the papers around her, her fingers shredding the evidence of her hunt, her movements frantic and aimless. She was destroying the map of her own obsession, frantically trying to erase the evidence of the woman she had spent years becoming. It was a scene of domestic tragedy so profound that it silenced the rest of the world. He was seeing the woman he married die, and in her place was a woman who had no idea how to live in a world where she wasn't a goddess. He was the only one who could witness this, the only one who had been the cause and the cure, and as she wept into his arms, he knew that their life would never, ever be the same again. The perfect couple was a lie, the billionaire's marriage was a prison, and tonight, the reality was finally, mercifully, catching up to them. The silence in the penthouse had reached a fever pitch, a vacuum of sound so intense it felt like the world had simply stopped rotating. Seo Yoon remained on the floor, her obsidian gown a pool of darkness around her, her fingers no longer clawing at the documents of her own malice. She had finally gone quiet. It was a silence that carried more weight than the previous days of rage and frantic manipulation. Kanyin stood over her, his own reflection in the darkened window showing a man he barely recognized, hollow, drained, and standing at the precipice of a decision that would define the rest of his existence. He looked at Seo Yoon, and for the first time in years, the terrifying billionaire wife, the iron-willed queen of the elite, was completely gone. In her place was a woman who had stripped herself of every defensive layer, someone who had nothing left to hide behind. She didn't look up, she kept her eyes fixed on the plush carpet, her breathing shallow, her posture a picture of ultimate, terrifying vulnerability. "I know you're thinking about leaving," she said, her voice so thin it was almost a ghost of a sound. She didn't sound like she was giving an order. She didn't sound like she was setting a trap. She sounded tired. "You have every right. I've turned our life into a cage, and I've turned myself into the jailer. I saw the way you looked at me when you found the study, with fear. And you were right to fear me. I'm a woman who would burn the world down to keep you in my sight. That's not love. That's a pathology. It's an obsession that ate me alive until there was nothing left but the need to keep you." She finally lifted her head, and Kanyin saw the tears streaming down her face, unhindered by the mask of poise she had worn for 5 years. She wasn't asking for his validation. She was finally acknowledging the truth of their tragedy. "I am a broken person, Kanyin. I thought that if I could hold you tightly enough, if I could make our marriage perfect enough, I would finally be real. But I'm just a hollow space. If you stay, you'll be trapped with me in this nightmare of control. If you leave, you'll be free, and I don't know if I'll survive. But you don't owe me your survival. You don't owe me your life. I've stolen enough of it already." The air in the room seemed to shatter. This was the first time she had ever relinquished control, the first time she had stopped trying to dictate his thoughts, his movements, or his future. She was offering him the key to the cage she had built, her hand trembling as she held it out in the space between them. Kanyin felt the choice pulling at him with the force of a tidal wave. To leave was to choose his own humanity, to walk away from the toxicity and the madness, to salvage the remnants of his identity before she eroded him entirely. But to leave was also to leave her in the wreckage of the obsession she had cultivated. She was a woman who had given up her brilliant future, her sanity, and her core humanity to serve a man who hadn't even realized he was being molded into a monument to her insecurity. He stepped toward her, his shadow falling over her, but he didn't reach down to pull her up, he just stood there, letting the silence bridge the chasm. "If I leave," he thought, the reality crushing him, "I leave the only woman who has ever truly, obsessively loved me, even if that love was a fire that turned everything to ash. If I stay, I am committing myself to the long, slow work of rebuilding a woman who doesn't know how to exist without me." He realized that the choice wasn't between leaving or staying, it was between being a prisoner of her obsession or a witness to her reconstruction. "I didn't need you to be perfect," Kanyin said, his voice raw, echoing in the vast, empty room. "I needed you to be my wife. Not my mirror, not my armor, not my jailer. Just Seo Yoon. The woman who walked into my life and made me feel like I was the most important thing in the universe. But you couldn't be her. You were too afraid that if you were just Seo Yoon, it wouldn't be enough for me. You were wrong. That was the only thing I ever really wanted." Seo Yoon's sobs grew quieter, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of profound grief and a terrifying, dawning hope. "I don't know how to be her anymore," she whispered. "I've spent so long being the perfect wife, the billionaire's partner, the woman in the obsidian gown, that I don't know where she ended and I began. If you stay, it won't be easy. I am a monster, Kang-in. You've seen what I did. You've seen what I'm capable of when I'm afraid. If you stay, we have to burn all of this. Everything. The reputation, the status, the control, the surveillance, all of it. We have to start from nothing. And I'm not sure I'm strong enough to be nothing with you." Kang-in looked around at the monitors, at the evidence of their ruined social lives, and the silence of the penthouse felt like a clean slate for the first time in years. He realized that she was finally being honest. She wasn't trying to manipulate him into staying, she was giving him the brutal, ugly truth of who they were. They were two broken people who had built a life on a foundation of professional obsession and fear, and the only way forward was a total, violent departure from everything they had pretended to be. He reached down and finally, gently, took her hands, pulling her up from the floor. She was weak, her body trembling, but she leaned into him, not with the possessive grip of a predator, but with the fragile, uncertain hold of someone who had finally realized they were drowning. "If I stay," Kang-in said, his voice a low, steady promise, "you stop. All of it. You stop the surveillance, you stop the hunting, you stop the control. You stop trying to be the perfect reflection and you start being the person who sat in that law school library dreaming of changing the world. You reclaim that part of you, Seo-yoon. Even if it scares you. Especially if it scares you." She looked at him, the tears still on her face, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of the woman she might have become if she hadn't spent 5 years erasing herself. She was terrified, but she was listening. She was letting him in, not as an asset, but as a witness. The emotional climax was not a grand, romantic gesture, it was the quiet, agonizing admission that they had both failed each other, and that their only hope for redemption was a long, painful descent from the pedestal they had built. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her head resting against his chest, her hands clutching his shirt as if it were the only solid thing in the world. "But I'll try. For you, I'll try. I'll be anyone you need me to be." Kang-in shook his head, a final, gentle rejection of her performative instinct. "No. That's exactly what I don't want. You don't have to be anyone for me. Just be Seo-yoon. The broken, messy, brilliant woman who was once a lawyer. I don't need a wife who is a goddess. I need a woman who is my partner." He stood there, holding her as the reality of their decision washed over them. They were leaving the empire, they were leaving the life of the billionaire's wife and the billionaire's husband, and they were entering a future where they would have to face the consequences of their own hollowed-out history. The note writer, the gala, the obsession, the hunt, it was all now the debris of a life they had survived. As the morning sun broke over the horizon, casting the penthouse in a soft, forgiving light, Kang-in realized that the last choice he had made was the only one that mattered. He wasn't choosing to save a marriage, he was choosing to save two people who had almost completely lost themselves in the act of being perfect. He let her go, just an inch, and saw her take a breath, a real, shaky, human breath. She was still terrified, and he was still scarred, but the cage was open. They were still in the room, but the walls were finally starting to fall. He was Kang-in, and she was Seo-yoon, and for the first time, they were just two people, standing in the middle of a broken home, ready to face the long, difficult work of becoming real. He took her hand, the grip not of a jailer or a captive, but of a man who was ready to walk into the uncertainty of a life without masks. The night was over, the battle for possession was done, and they were finally, painfully, ready to be human. He walked toward the window, looking out at the city that would now be a stranger to them, and as Seo-yoon followed him, her steps cautious and light, he knew that the choice he had made was the only way they could ever truly survive each other. The perfection was dead. Long live the mess. 2 years had passed, and the penthouse, once a cold, echoing monument to perfection, now felt like a home, filled with the warmth of a life that no longer required constant surveillance. The Warren Empire had undergone a tectonic shift, Kang-in had stepped back from the front lines, and Seo-yoon had spent the better part of those 24 months in a quiet, painstaking reconstruction of her own identity. She had returned to the law, not as a desperate attempt to prove anything, but as a path to reclaiming the brilliance she had once discarded. She was a different woman. Her obsidian gowns were traded for structured, professional blazers, and her once manicured, possessive gaze had softened into something curious, engaged, and genuinely grounded. They sat together in the study, the very room that had once served as her war room, now transformed into a shared space where they read and worked in a companionable, unforced silence. The obsession that had nearly consumed them had not vanished overnight, but it had been tamed by the admission of their shared humanity. Seo Yoon no longer greeted him at the door with a desperate, rehearsed performance of the doting wife. She greeted him with the warmth of a partner who had her own day, her own stresses, and her own world to return to. Kanyeon watched her as she highlighted a legal brief, her focus sharp and purposeful, and he felt a profound sense of relief that he was no longer the sole anchor of her existence. They had learned to communicate not through the lens of performance, but through the reality of their struggles, and for the first time, their marriage felt like a living, breathing thing. It was Halloween again, the anniversary of the night that had almost shattered them, and the city was once again draped in the costumes of the elite. This year, they were attending a low-key gathering at a friend's gallery, a far cry from the opulent, cutthroat gala of the past. As they walked through the gallery, Seo Yoon caught her reflection in a glass display case. She laughed, a genuine, easy sound that signaled a total surrender to the woman she actually was. She no longer felt the need to be the perfect, porcelain statue the world expected of her. She was just Seo Yoon, a lawyer, a wife, and a woman who had survived the fire of her own ego. They stopped near the entrance, where a basket of small, anonymous treats and cards had been left for the guests. A young woman, clearly an intern, hurried over to hand them each a small, sealed envelope. "Just a fun tradition for the night," the girl chirped, her face bright and completely devoid of any malice. Seo Yoon took the envelope, a flicker of something ancient and instinctive crossing her face, but she held it steady, her fingers not trembling. She tore it open and pulled out a small, handwritten note. Kanyeon tensed, his breath catching in his throat as he watched her. The note contained a short, biting sentence, a prank meant to rattle the nerves of the wealthy socialites attending the party. For a heartbeat, the air in the gallery seemed to sharpen, the memory of the dirty housewife note rising like a phantom between them. Kanyeon waited for the mask to drop, waited for the obsession to resurface, for the frantic hunt to begin, for the cold, predatory silence to return. But Seo Yoon didn't stiffen. She didn't hunt for a culprit, and she didn't search the crowd with the eyes of a killer. She simply read the words, tilted her head, and let out a soft, melodic laugh that was entirely devoid of pain. She turned to Kanyeon, her eyes bright with a self-awareness that was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "A witch who can't stop time," she repeated, her smile reaching her eyes. "Well, she's not entirely wrong. I am getting older, and I am certainly more than a little witchy when the mood strikes me." She crumpled the note into a small ball and tossed it into a nearby trash bin without a second thought, her attention returning to him, to the life they had built, and to the calm, steady future that awaited them outside. Kanyeon felt a weight lift from his soul that he hadn't realized was still there, the fear that her perfection was a prison, the fear that their happiness was always one insult away from collapse. But she was free. She had let go of the need to be the mirror, and in doing so, she had finally let him go, too. They walked out of the gallery into the crisp, cool autumn air, the city lights shimmering in the distance like beacons of a life that no longer had anything to prove. Seo Yoon tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, her grip confident and light, the possessiveness replaced by the simple, enduring warmth of companionship. She was no longer a sculpture, no longer an artifact, and no longer the prisoner of a standard that had never existed. They walked toward their car, leaving the party and the ghosts of their past behind them, walking side by side as equals. Kanyeon looked at her, seeing the woman who had walked through the fire and chosen to stay on the other side, and he knew that their journey had finally reached its end. They were just two people, a man and his wife, driving away from the noise and the judgment of a world that would always try to dictate who they should be. The obsession was buried, the perfection was dead, and the life that remained was all theirs, messy, real, and finally, deeply, beautifully, theirs. He realized that the note, that one, simple scrap of paper, had been the most important gift he had ever received, because it had forced them to see that the life they were protecting wasn't worth the cost of their humanity. And as the car glided through the streets of Seoul, the night wind blowing through the open windows, Seo Yoon leaned her head against his shoulder, not as a reflection, but as a person, at peace with the woman she had fought so hard to become. The nightmare of the perfect wife had finally faded, and the life that dawned was something they had built with their own hands, imperfect, fragile, and absolutely, wonderfully enough. He didn't look back at the gallery, he didn't look at the city, And he didn't worry about the whispers of the elite, he just held her hand, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of their future, finally home.